Well, we're going to be talking about a very specific subject today, which is about DC and writing for DC and creating for DC. It's, I think, for a lot of us as comic fans, we kind of see DC as this big monolith, this very stern, big organization, which at the end of the day, we don't know how artists and writers kind of communicate and interact with them and interact with the characters that they inhabit. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to find out a little bit more about that in this session today. First things first, I think it's only fair that we welcome on stage my special guest here, IRL, ladies and gentlemen, the colorist of Watchmen and Killing Joke, and indeed numerous of comics over the course of the years, the living legend that is John Higgins, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, John. In fact, I'm going to remove the jacket because it is a little bit... Hello there. Yes, this is where we all now look to the big screen and say hi to Jeff Johnson, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Johnson.
Hi, everyone.
Now, Jeff is certainly within the world of comics and is a known quantity. Hopefully, we're going to be joined by Dave Johnson, who I understand we're going to try and get online at some point. But we'll dive in with the rest of the conversation first. But yes, sir, how the devil are you?
Hey.
How are you?
Really good.
Have we got these microphones on? Excellent stuff.
Yep, I hope so.
Excellent. So, yeah, how has the last year and a half treated you, sir? How have you coped throughout the course of pandemic? Shall we get that conversation out of the way first? How have you done? How have you done?
I think one of the great things of any pandemic is the fact that you get to spend time by yourself and with close family. The sad thing is you don't get time to come out to conventions like this. So I've missed every single one of you in particular, and I've really enjoyed being able to come here.
Not the rest of you, just you.
Yeah, that one there. So I'm really, really looking forward to having a good chat with everyone. And this morning has started really, really well. And we know it's like social distancing. I think, Jeff, the idea is like social distancing for like 5,000 miles is pretty extreme, but nice to see you here.
It's nice to meet you, John.
And yourself, Jeff, if you can give us how life has been for you for the last 18, 19 months. How's things been for yourself?
They've been, the life of an artist, as John knows, is mostly solitary anyway. So it hasn't been much of a shift to just stay at my desk, even more so, though I do miss going to shows. I would be there right now if it weren't for this situation.
Indeed. Just so people maybe, like I say, aware of Jeff's work as an artist, but also as a podcaster as well. I mean, there's a number of podcasts that I rate very, very highly. And Cartoonist Kayfabe is one, Panel by Panel is another, and Jeff's effort. If you've not checked it out, the original Drink and Draw Social, which goes live on a Thursday, where some of the biggest hitters in comics come together, have an alcoholic beverage, and basically draw throughout the course of what we consider the nighttime. It's a hell of a show and well worth checking out. So we're talking DC and the relationship with DC, and I think we'll start with your actual relationship with DC and starting reading comics and your personal history with DC and DC characters. What were the first books that you kind of picked up with that silver bullet on the cover?
I think for me as a young comics fan, and even as an old comics fan, Batman has always been my go-to character. And when I was a kid, so reading the Neil Adams Batman in particular, Denny O'Neil, which they treated Batman in a serious way. They were talking about drugs in America at that particular time, which is something that just wasn't entertained in American comics because of the code, the national censorship code that they had. Things have changed so much over the last 30, 40 years. But yeah, Batman's been my go-to character all the time with DC.
I mean, I think with Denny as well at that point as well, the transition he brought to that title and Detective Comics at that time. I mean, Secret of the Waking Graves remains one of my all-time favorite books. That is just a stellar piece of work. That transition into, like you say, a more serious and a more contemporary Batman as well, because I think there was kind of like this sense that he was always still in the 1940s, this idyllic Gotham. This was very much a more 1970s, 1980s period. And yourself, Jeff, your personal history with DC, what books were you reading and checking out when you were getting into comics?
when I was a kid, the only place you could really get comics was at the 7-Eleven or the local drugstore. And so the one of my first comics I ever found that I fell in love with DC was Legion of Superheroes. It had a Karate Kid issue drawn by Steve Lytle that I just fell in love with the characters and the art. And then after that, I was just a lifelong fan.
Excellent stuff. And what was the relationship then with yourselves when you saw DC in the wider concepts of comics? Because obviously people kind of come in either DC, Marvel, or whatever. I mean, was DC something for yourself that stood apart, or was it just something that was just part of your comics reading?
Yeah, certainly for me. I mean, because I was started before we had national distribution. I mean, I was incredibly lucky. So like growing up in Liverpool in the 60s, we were a port, as you might know. In those days, we were a port. Now we're just so like on the Beatles tour, basically. But in those days, when I was growing up, we were an active port. And they used to import American comics. So we actually got the proper, not reprint, but the full color American comics in Liverpool. And we were the first people to get it, as far as I know, alongside other ports like, London and Hartlepool, whatever. But the great thing is sort of like, the sort of comics that used to come in through Liverpool could have been anything from Marvel and DC. I remember when I was a kid, I actually used to have #1 Spider-Man, #1 Hulk, all these classic comics that just, if I'd have kept them, I would have been.
You would not be here.
I would have retired years and years ago. I don't know if Jeff was at the same San Diego that I was at, but it was the 75th anniversary of Superman about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And at the party, were you at the party at Heavy Rock Cafe?
No, I missed that one.
Yeah.
It was the Hard Rock. You may have been there. You just might not remember it at this point.
You were there, but if you don't remember, you weren't there. But yeah, they actually brought #1 Superman, from 1936. Was it?
Wow.
39.
Wow.
And it came with sort of like armed guards and a police squad, for the San Diego police. And it was an air-controlled box, armor-proofed, bulletproof box. I just could not believe it. And I was talking to one of the policemen later at the bar. He wasn't drinking, he was drinking water, and I was drinking lots of other alcoholic beverages. And I was talking to him, and I was sort of like saying, wow, you a proper policeman, because he looked like a, central casting. And he was a proper San Diego policeman. And they had like 6 police and 2 security guards protecting this comic. And I think it was something like $3.5 million.
Wow.
An original prime copy of Superman #1. And I was sort of like saying, well, where did it come from? Who owned it? And it was Jack White, the musician, Jack White, owns one original copy of Superman. And I was saying, well, what happened to, the DC archive copy? And apparently in the 1970s, someone in the archives decided, well, they want to keep it in pristine condition. So they separated every single page and mounted it in, plastic. So it's completely utterly worthless, but it looked pristine, separated individually. So they actually hide it for something like $30,000 a night, from Jack White, how to make money in comics.
Well, that means that's why we're not getting White Stripes albums at the moment. He's too busy hiring out his Superman comic. Good grief. For yourself, Jeff, then, I mean, was it DC exclusively, or where were you with comics? Was it across the board? Where did you really in the shelf?
I never really had a loyalty to one or the other. I was always more drawn to the art than the logo. So depending, I would flip through the book, and if I was inspired by it or I liked it, then I would get it. I think that I was much more of a Green Lantern fan than a Superman fan, especially later on when Kyle became a character. But I just always, one of the things about comics for me, growing up, I moved around quite a bit. So whatever comics you could get your hands on was the one you wanted.
Sure. I mean, I think for myself with DC, the thing that kind of attracted me to the brand, it's just the lexicon of characters. I mean, like you were saying, Jeff, you came in via Legion of Superheroes, and you talked about some, slightly, not second tier characters, but other characters in the lexicon. And you're talking about Batman and Superman. DC has never, I feel, okay, I was about to say they've never relied on their top tier, but then they have marketed around the Trinity, as it were, the Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman Trinity. But they have got this huge lexicon of characters. I mean, how far did, say for yourself, how did your reading go? Was it just kind of like the top tier characters, or how far did you get into like the distant corners of the DC character list? How far did you go?
Yes, everything. I just
you went the whole way.
DC. Yeah. Any American comics I could get, I just read. Didn't matter who they were. When I went to art college, I discovered the underground comics in America, and they were coming out of like the definite underground, you know, the drug subculture. And I know we're talking about DC, just like with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Batman. I mean, they were talking about drugs, but when it's like the underground comics came into it, it gave me a different perspective. So I tend to leave comics behind, mainstream comics behind, because there's an alternative view of what sort of like entertainment you could get from comics. And I think in a way, it's like, you know, if we talk about the big monolithic Marvel and DC publishing houses, completely different, just like the creativity you get out of smaller publishing houses. And I'm sure Jeff has certainly been involved along those lines.
Sure. I mean, when I think the first books from DC I was reading was Brave and the Bold. So it wasn't just the one character. You kind of had these books where you had these characters coming together. So there was this sense of a larger DC universe which you could explore. For yourself, Jeff, I mean, how far down the rabbit hole do you go when it comes to your...
I mean,
how obscure do your...
When I was first trying to break into comics, right out of actually right before I graduated high school, I sent DC a submission of The Warlord, because that was my favorite book at the time. That's how far down I went. I loved The Warlord, and I was so young and naive that I actually sent them original Warlord pages because I thought that's how it was done.
Okay, so let's ask that question then. You establishing yourself in comics, you're making your inroads into the industry, and DC either reaches out or you reach out to DC. What was the first kind of conversation then with?
Well, I mean, I never actually got a response from sending those pages in. They were not very good. But I broke in. I was going to cons back in the day. You could just go to cons and meet actual people who worked in comics. So you can meet the editors, you could meet other people. Marvel and DC and all the other publishers would actually send editors and staff out to comic book shows. And I met Fabian Nicieza when he was still just a marketing guy at Marvel, and he was incredibly helpful. And then over the years, we became friends, and he would send me scripts, and he would give me pointers, and he would let me know how to be a better storyteller, and let me know what Marvel was looking for. And eventually, when he became an editor, he gave me my first shot drawing a comic.
Okay. And for yourself?
I think that's really interesting what Jeff was saying there, because to a certain extent, I rode in on someone else's very talented coattails, which is Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. But the idea of some sort of apprenticeship sort of thing, and it's like some monitoring of the abilities of the talent. I mean, that is a great thing about going to conventions, comic conventions. And it's like bigger publishers do tend to do very professional portfolio reviews. And if you are based in New York or close to one of the major publishers, in the days that sort of like Jeff and I first started working for DC and Marvel, you could go in to see editors, you could actually deal with people face to face. And I was saying to someone earlier today, that's like one of the problems for a modern artist is you do not get the opportunity, certainly that I had, by going over to New York and seeing Marvel and DC and seeing the editors face to face. You just cannot get through the doorway now. I don't know if Jeff had any problems in the early days actually getting in to see the editors, but I found it was a great way to like go over and see the people that became the names that you actually recognized from reading the books, but you saw them as friends, you socialized with them. So maybe Jeff had a similar story in the early days.
Wow, Jeff?
Absolutely. So one of the things one of the tricks to being, well, because as a John, as you know, you have to not only sell your work, you have to sell yourself as someone people want to work with. And the only way you could do that back in the day, before the internet, back in the Stone Age, really, is that you had to meet someone face to face and become, and shake someone's hand and smile and get to know them a little bit. One of the best tricks I learned is that if you could get in to see one editor at Marvel or DC, then you could, after you were done with that meeting, you could then wander the halls and find yourself knocking on another editor's door, just basically hunting for any kind of opportunity. But yeah, you can't really do that anymore. Times have totally changed.
What's the difference between the perception of, when you were a young comics writer or comics creator, of what you thought working for DC was going to be like, was against the actual reality of working with DC? I mean, as a company, as a group of editors, as a group of creatives, what was the biggest culture shock of actually working for the company, would you say?
I think that back in the 90s when I was doing stuff for Marvel, before it went public, it was a much smaller operation. I don't know if it was technically a smaller operation, but it felt like a much tighter knit group of people. And so when you went to go, you would go and you would have lunch. I remember that there were Marvel Christmas parties and there were Marvel trips that you would have. And it was definitely felt much more like a family. Even back then, DC always seemed to have much more of a, I don't think corporate was the right phrase, but business approach. Wow. to the comics back then. But that kind of flip-flops depending on who your editor is and what era you're in. And so now the stuff I've done for DC is very friendly and seems like they're trying to foster that idea of that you're part of the family, even if it's only in the one little area. Say you're in the Batman office or the Green Lantern office.
So it's almost like they're trying to fight back against that reputation they've kind of garnered, as it were.
I think so. I think the both of the companies right now, I think, are trying to figure out how to keep artists, get them the best work out of artists, and get everyone to do their best work. And I think that's a tough question now, since every artist has so many other options that enticing people over can be, I think it can be tricky.
Yeah. For yourself, that relationship between what you thought working for DC was going to be like against the reality of it.
Well, it's the same as Jeff was saying. It was so much more relaxed. I mean, I know this is certainly in my case, an old guy telling you how much better it was in the old days. But I remember when I first used to go over, because a lot of British creators traveled from the UK to New York, and then Marvel was down one end of town and it's like DC were up the other end of town. We tried to see both companies the same trip before we started working for one or the other. And one of the things they used to say was exactly what Jeff was saying. It's like, the Marvel team used to seem to be like you're visiting a frat house, like a university where people came and went. People left from one week to the next, whereas when you used to go into DC, it was like going around to an accountant's offices. Everyone was very, not necessarily friendly wise, but they were more formal. The offices was like not so much jammed together the way they were at a very small DC Marvel offices. But one of the things I learned, and probably one of the things that was pretty good for the British creators, was the fact that they tend to know we enjoyed maybe a drink or two. They tend to like to go out with the British creators. And I found if you turned up at the offices at Marvel or DC Friday lunchtime, you might go to lunchtime Friday and not finish till 11 o'clock Friday night, which is actually quite a nice way of socializing with the editor. Mm-hmm. I remember falling out of a really nice, do you remember the Rodeo Bar?
I do. There was particularly around the DC offices, there were some great Irish bars.
McGee's.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, McGee's. They used to have when I lived out there for a few years as well, and it's like DC used to do a DC night at McGee's where everything was on tap, which is actually very, very nice.
Yeah. So your introduction with the company was through Watchmen, through Alan Moore and the Watchmen project.
Yeah.
Of course. I think what many people would like to learn is about then that relationship with DC in putting that book together, and how much free, because obviously we're talking thousands of miles of distance, and I believe there was some faxes of pages going backwards and forwards, certainly between artist and writer, and then you got involved as well, getting around. What was the relationship in making that? Oh, hello. Hello, Dave. How are you, sir? Just jumping on there. We've got a gate crash here. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Johnson. A round of applause, please. Known predominantly as a cover artist, but certainly interiors as well for DC. Welcome along. How are you, sir? Have you been listening in?
No, I woke up at 4 a.m. and then I hit the snooze button and it didn't go off. So here I am.
Fair enough. Well, we've been talking about you behind your back for the last half an hour, so hopefully your ears but it's all been about you and about how you work with people and how you've been upsetting them for the last, it's all like 20 years. But no, we've been talking about the relationship with DC. Hopefully you can catch up a little bit with the conversation we're having. But no, we're talking about the relationship with DC and yourselves as creatives putting together Watchmen. I mean, we're talking thousands of miles apart. What was the relationship in terms of any hands-on interaction? How did they guide you and guide the project?
When I started working for DC, it really was on the back of Alan and Dave's very creative coattails.
Yeah.
And the reason Solly Callan and Dave asked me to do the colouring was because they wanted to keep a European, UK-based team. So we didn't necessarily have those thousands of miles distance in relationship to the work we got from the writer, the letterer, which is Dave Gibbons, and the artist, and then the colour artist. So we actually all lived within about like an hour's drive of each other, so we met quite regularly. And me and Dave used to meet a lot of times just to sort of shoot the breeze and have a couple of beers and, you know, maybe talk about comics, but that was bottom end of the agenda. So actually just having one team in one place was actually a really time-saving device. Yeah. And I've never experienced that before. Just
to interject as well, because also with Watchmen, I mean, I think the reason why I brought up the question about the relationship with DC and the project, if anyone knows the genesis of the Watchmen book, it was a number of Carlton characters which they had bought as a group, which they wanted to develop and do something with. Alan suggests that he wanted to effectively reinvent some of the Carlton characters. DC felt that the reinvention idea was a little bit too far, and therefore Alan pretty much created his own to kind of circumvent those places. So I can imagine if they'd have stuck with the DC, with the Carlton characters, which they owned, there'd have been a little bit more of a hands-on affair, I suspect.
Yeah, I think there wouldn't have been so much controversy about reusing the Watchmen characters, which they have done over the last 20 odd years. I don't know. I think Watchmen created an imprint in the universe of its own now.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, like the Watchman smiley badge with the splash of blood is probably as recognizable as Mickey Mouse's ears. But you're right. I mean, what would they have done with the Carlton characters?
Yeah. And how hands-on they would have been, you know, and how the restraints they may have put on Alan and John. So, like you say, it was a nice, controlled, creative knit within an hour's drive of each other. At what point then did DC get involved when it came to sending the pages backwards and forwards, and how the conversation that they were having with you as creatives? What was that like?
I think the great thing and the weird thing, I mean, these other American artists and writers will tell you FedEx in the early days was just like a joy to deal with.
Yeah.
To send original artwork that disappears into the middle of nowhere is one of the biggest fears of a freelancer. Mm-hmm. Now, thank God, digitally we can do it's like within seconds. But in those days, you had to build in that fail-safe 3 or 4 days. And I know these guys are based all over America, so you probably had as much trouble as we did, like sending FedEx boxes.
Yeah.
There were many a frantic run at 4:45 to get to the photocopy place and the FedEx place and get stuff in the mail so it could be there next day. Yeah, it was always an adventure.
I
Yeah, go for it, Dave.
I actually hate to admit it, but I actually used FedEx to my advantage once when I knew I was missing a deadline. I took a FedEx box, sealed it, then ripped it open, then resealed it again, and then sent them an empty box.
Yeah.
And then claimed that I put the pages in there.
Criminal.
A couple of more days. So they couldn't blame me. They blame FedEx because I'm a horrible person.
Just to kind of backtrack then, just to get your brief history, because we were talking about our the history, your personal history with DC, Dave. Just the books that you were reading, getting into the introduced to DC universe. What books were you reading?
I was a total Marvel zombie. I really didn't like the vibe of DC. It just didn't seem as cool to me as a kid, or a teenager growing up. And it wasn't until later, which was ironic because DC was definitely giving me most of my work starting out. I did a series called Chain Gang War with Alan Grant. John Wagner. I'm sorry, John Wagner. God, yeah, like you said, I just woke up. And once there, that's when I started learning or discovering a love for like Superman and Batman. So
we were talking about that as well, about the lexicon of characters with DC. Was it the kind of top tier guys that you were reading, or did you go a little bit down in the weeds and some of the other kind of characters all the way down in the rabbit hole?
It was mainly the main characters. I mean, honestly, I was as a comic book fan, I was more of a fan of the artists than the characters. So it seemed like most of the artists I liked were more of Marvel. They were doing more Marvel work, except for Mike Golden, who did some Batman family stuff here and there. But for the most part, I was more just following the artists I liked. So
excellent stuff. So quickly, we'll return to the talking about the Watchmen. I understand we've got some slides that you would like to show. What's the slides relating to in regards to what we've got?
I can't remember what slides.
We were. I mean, we'll bring the slides up so at least we can we'll see them, and you can kind of hopefully remind yourself what we were bringing into. Yeah, there. Well, Watchmen and Killing Joke, obviously the two of the big DC projects that you're most known of.
Yeah,
and and there it is, the smiley face.
Yeah, I mean, even if you crop it in, as I was saying, for me, it's become one of those highly recognizable universal images almost. That's like you can look at, and even cropped in, you can recognize what the yellow is, what the blood splashes, and what the black is. For me, I mean, Dave Gibbons, when we spoke about the coloring in the early days, he knew sort of like yellow really pumped things forward. So we went along with that idea quite a lot. And obviously when Dave designed the black and yellow and then the splash of blood, it just became an iconic, image for me. And it was great fun to do it. And particularly when we went into reprint, because we did lots of different covers for the different editions of Watchmen. And when you pulled in closer and closer and closer and got smaller and still made it a very recognizable image, you could do it in half the time and still get paid the same amount of money. And that's a great thing for a freelancer. Mm-hmm. Another thing is the Killing Joke was another thing I did with Alan Moore and Brian Bolland. And Alan Moore has been my connection with both of those particular titles. And to a certain extent, I find it slightly weird because I'm more well known for those two particular titles, which probably runs into about 200 pages compared to the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages I've drawn throughout my career for my own projects, Judge Dredd, Razorjack, and Constantine, and so on and so forth. Yet those 200 pages make me, in a certain circle, more recognizable than the thousands and thousands of other pages. But I got paid more for the other pages than those pages, so it works out in the end.
I'm guessing, I mean, is that because it was published through DC? Because you've got that marketing machine, you've got that massive audience that DC brings with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of other slides here which possibly, yeah. I got the opportunity, once I'd rode in on David Allen's coattails, I got the opportunity to do my own things, World Without End. And I think the guys will tell you the same thing. The advantages of working for a big, massive corporation is the fact that you tend to get a regular page packet at the end of a set amount of time. And also they tend to sort of repackage your work time and time again. So these titles, World Without End, I did 20, 30 years ago, and it's been reprinted and sold all the way around the world. And the fact that I can actually continue doing what I do, and I actually spend more time on a page now than I did 20, 30 years ago, is because I get a little bit of royalties from every single thing that's sold around the world through Marvel and DC. And I get checks for $5, certainly from Marvel, of stuff that I did 20, 30 years ago I even forgot about. It actually costs me more money if they send me a $5 check to change it into sterling than it actually is worth my while getting that $5. So I tend to have lots of $5 checks from Marvel. I think they plan it, you know. They don't send it you all in one big check of $500. They send you 50 $5 checks, you know. You never cash them because it costs £9 to cash a check and turns into sterling, which is ridiculous.
I don't want you to cast aspersions on them. I don't want you to slag anybody off, but how good are DC on keeping up with the foreign rights stuff? Because obviously they are reprinting on a regular basis. They are wanting new audiences to discover these books. How well do they keep up with you on that?
DC are actually very, very good. Marvel, I'm not too sure about, but because I've still worked for Marvel up until the last couple of years, maybe I'm at the forefront of their paycheck. You know, the accountants at least know my name regularly, so I do get like 3 or 4 pages of royalties. And I've done odd things because I know lots of writers and creators, and so I'm asked to do a pin-up here and there. So if I do a pin-up, say, for the Preacher Collected Edition, which is the great Steve Dillon and Garth Ennis. I mean, Preacher, I did about 2 pin-ups for that, and I get something like $15. They actually sell so many that for just one image, I get $15 every time it's reprinted, and that's quite nice. Some titles, you know, DC, I'd say, they will mark it and tell you you've earned 5 cents on this particular reprint. And it's weird, but yes, I get paid, and they are very, very good. DC are very, very good. I can't speak about Marvel. I don't know what these guys can tell us, but
I mean, I think the general perception is a little bit like whenever Watchmen is reprinted, it's a little bit like Slade at Christmas when they get when Merry Christmas, everyone comes out in January, he's getting a nice little paycheck. I think the perception is that every time that a new issue of or a new edition of Watchmen, you know, it gets published on Black Label or something, a nice little check comes through the door. And
it is, I mean, it's really, really strange because I actually didn't get paid until the Absolute Edition, which is only about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
For the first 22 years, I never got a penny from Watchmen, an additional penny from Watchmen, which is slightly niggles me a bit, but not that much. But since the movie, get a little bit of royalties from Watchmen. And when they did the large size black and white edition, they've just brought some new on convention and laughed in my face and said, "You're not getting a penny for this one." Because I didn't colour the black and white one.
Fair enough. We'll talk to, we've got another slide. I think we've got a couple of slides, so we'll deal with these. So we've got Hellblazer, we've got Jacked on screen as well. If you'd like to.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry to take all the time from the two guys on the other side of the line.
Well, no, we're going to return to Supergirl shortly.
Well, let's quickly talk about those 2 slides,
yeah, sure.
The last 2 slides.
Just go back. Yep,
it's almost like my longevity at DC. I mean, I did like Southern Man with Garth Ennis, which is on John Constantine, Hellblazer, and did that in the mid-90s. And the last thing, which is the Eric Kripke Jacked thing I did about 3 or 4 years ago. And for me, the great thing was the continuity, because Eric Kripke was a student when Eric Kripke is the runner on The Boys, Netflix, I think it's a Netflix series. And he was also created Supernatural. And DC asked him to write something. It's like a slightly modern superhero thing, which turned out to be Jacked. And if anyone who you're interested more than we're just talking about, come to my table and I'll sell you some copies at a really good discount price. But anyway, Jacked, like they approached Eric Kripke to ask him if he would write a a modernish sort of like superhero character. And he liked Son of Man, which I did 25 years ago when he was a student. So he said, well, I'd like to work with John Higgins, which I thought was a massive compliment. So DC rang me up just to check to make sure I was still alive, and apparently I am. So they asked me to work on that with Ever Crispy. So I love that continuity and the longevity, and it just worked out really, really well for me. So that's another good thing about working for a big company. You know, if as much as I love small independent companies, and you really should read what they have, there's some really good guys out there, small independent companies, Accent, UK, and a couple of other companies doing their own individual creative stuff. So definitely check them out in the tent out there after you buy my copy of Jacked. And but it's that sort of like the fact that they are going to be there generation after generation after generation, thank God. So we can, if we're lucky, keep working for them and keep getting paid by them.
Makes sense. Okay. So returning to our American brethren online. Yeah, so we have Supergirl up on screen at the moment, and obviously a major character, someone who has grown in popularity over the years. We've got the series that's on television at the moment and continues to garner new audiences. But for yourself, I believe it's Jeff. It's Jeff that's the artist on that. I mean, writing for a character with that longevity and having to work with DC to continually evolve the character. I mean, how much leeway are you given when it comes to a top tier character like Supergirl to create and move forward with her history in the books?
Well, so I was the penciler for that particular issue, where she destroys the red ring when she was wearing the lantern ring. And it was a really, really fun gig. I primarily put that image up because it's one of my all-time favorite covers, and it was inked by Cam Smith, a countryman of yours. And I just wanted to give a little shout out because it was a fun story. But one of the things I like about DC is you get to the talent is amazing. So often the group effort comes out to be much better than you could have done on your own. And that was a prime example of that because Cam's a fantastic inker and he made me look great. But when you're drawing someone like Supergirl, the thing about comics is different than the TV shows or I think any of the other medium is like, once you get hired, you're pretty much on your own. The deadlines are fierce, and when they hire you, they mostly trust you to do your job. So a lot of freedom there, actually, to draw her the way I felt she looked.
Okay, who was the editor on that particular? I think a lot of people, when it comes to comics, I was recently hosting an awards thing about comics, and I introduced about the idea of the editor being the master of the dark arts. Not really people really know what an editor really does in comics and how they kind of are really herding a lot of cats when it comes to putting a project up on stage, on the page, sorry. But I think an editor really does determine the tone of how a project goes forward. I mean, so who was the editor on that particular project?
If memory serves, and it doesn't always, I think that might have been Ricky Purdon.
Right.
When he was at DC.
Yeah. Good guy.
Great guy.
From what I've been hearing, or what I heard about Ricky as well, very, he really, like you say, he's not hands off, but he gives a lot of freedom to his creative team.
I did a couple of projects with Ricky, and every time he called me up and asked me if I was interested, and we talked about it. And then once I got the script, he left me alone. You know, he hired me, and then he trusted me. It's fun to work with someone who hires you on purpose and knows what to expect, and then just leaves you alone. I'm not going to name names, but I was once hired to do a gig, and then when I started turning in pages, they asked me to draw if I could draw like someone else, and I thought, like, no, I can't actually draw like someone else. I don't know how to do that. But that only happened once. I think most of the time, an editor who knows their stuff hires you to do a gig and leaves you alone to do that gig.
When it comes to DC, then when things do start getting close to the wire, how big does the machine get in terms of coming down on creative teams to get things back on track? I can imagine for like a small independent thing, there isn't that much of that kind of muscle, but it's DC. It's a big entity, and I can imagine the hammer gets bigger.
I do remember I did a Justice League miniseries called Midsummer's Nightmare a long time ago, and I had drawn the Batcave, and in the Batcave I had Bruce Wayne walking past a bunch of alternate Bat costumes, and I had the one from the first movie, the Bat costume from the TV show, and I think I might have even had a toy one that I thought were cool little Easter eggs. But a lawyer saw those, and then I had to change them because DC Comics didn't have the visual rights to those images. So you never quite know when the hammer's going to fall. Okay.
For yourself, Dave, if we can bring you in, your relationship with working with DC, sort of like projects that stand out for you, and how the company has been for you working on those projects.
For the most part, working for DC has been excellent. My relationship with Mark Chiarello, the art director, is, bar none, one of my favorite relationships ever working in comics. And I was really sad when, DC let him go to replace him effectively with nobody. Having a good creative art director like that, he's the guy that brings the most creative projects, like, Batman Black and White and the Wednesday comics and things like that. And, working with them now, it's almost like it's a completely different company. I barely know anybody. They've let all the older editors go, and now it's a bunch of young editors who I've never met. So my work with them has significantly dropped off. Luckily, other smaller independent companies have stepped up and kept me busy. But it's nice every once in a while I'll get a call to do like a variant cover, but for the most part, it's been excellent.
Yeah. Do you think the last year and a half, 2 years now, where we've not had comic conventions and that way of networking with entities like DC and Marvel, has that affected your relationship with the company? Because I can imagine, like you say, it's mostly emails. It's knowing the people and having that corporate entity evolve and change and lose people as it does. I can imagine that really kind of makes working with them a bit of a struggle.
Yeah, a lot of jobs have been gained from having a drink with somebody at a convention, and you're not really getting that anymore, or at least currently. So, I can't tell you how many jobs I've got just because I met somebody at Comic-Con in a bar, and just hanging out, two professionals talking. So
BarCon's the big part of it, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, I know it's gotten a bad rap lately, because people can't hold their liquor and they do stupid things. But ultimately, back in the 90s and 2000s, it was a great thing. You got to hang out with people you never get to see. Yeah. It was like having a reunion every year with a bunch of people that normally you would never see. So, the whole online thing is great and all, but it can't replace human to human interaction, so.
When it comes to yourself and so like standout projects for yourself, those moments working with DC and working with DC characters, which are moments and characters and stories that really stand out for yourself?
Well, I've mainly been a cover artist for a majority of my career, but when I did Superman Red Sun That was a big thing. I wish I had finished it, but I don't want to go into why I didn't. It was mostly my fault. But working on 100 Bullets, once again, I got that job because of Mark Chiarello. And that was a good 10 years worth of steady cover gigs. So nothing but respect and love for the work I've done for DC.
Sure. I think we've all seen how DC and Marvel have continually evolved and constantly changed their relationship with their audience. I mean, when I've been talking about DC in recent years, there have been the idea that DC kind of lost contact with its audience. It was kind of struggling to work out how to connect with its audience, but it's only, I think, almost pandemic focused, and they had to pivot to something a little bit more controlled and a little bit more, well, not controlled, sorry, a way for stories to evolve a little bit more naturally. I think if anyone's reading DC at the moment, I'm for myself, I'm reading more DC than I have done in years. When it comes to DC now, and also kind of moving forward, and this is, we'll start with yourself, John. I mean, what do you see for DC now and moving forward? Do you see them evolving in the right direction, or do you kind of, is it the same old big company?
No,
same
I
old
think
story?
sadly they've changed just too much. I mean,
You think?
I think I completely must agree with what's just been said. Once they started getting rid of these traditional, well-established editors, things changed, and there's no reason why young editors can't come in and start producing good quality work. There's no reason why that can't happen at all. Of course not. But there's longevity. There used to be like something solid, satisfying, not necessarily always safe with DC, but you used to go there and you knew what was happening, and you used to get quality work. They shouldn't lose sight of what they're doing. They've got some great characters, and no reason why that should change too much. They're still using great freelancers, like hopefully us three. And, hopefully this talented work will continue, and there'll be that continuity. At least for me, the biggest disappointment was when they left Gotham City, moving from New York over to the non-stop sunshine and fires of Burbank was the biggest mistake they ever made. And not only in a number of ways, that they brutally just sacked people for no reason whatsoever, from the very top down to there, all the way down to the.
It was brutal. It was brutal. It was across the board.
That's not what comics companies should do. That's disgusting, and they lied about every single thing they did. I was there when I got the round robin email saying when they were going to move half of editorial to Burbank, they promised they would always have an editorial presence in New York. They lied. They said that no one will lose the jobs. They lied. They just cut people dead, and they threw people away. And it made me really disgusted with management at DC. Editors at DC, they're the people that the freelancers deal with. They're the people we love, we socialize with, and we get on with. Management, faceless. That's what DC has become now. They filtered down stupid decisions from on high. And I'm getting quite emotional because we're losing friends brutally. There's no safety net if you're freelance now, anywhere in the world. It's like in America, it's brutal. And I think DC, the way they've treated the staff and freelance is quite disgusting.
Is that the same kind of vibe as what you two, Dave and Jeff? Is that how? Certainly. I mean, you've got. We were talking about the podcast that they host, and Joe Quesada is somebody who had a long history with DC. I mean, is that the kind of conversations that you guys have as well?
I mean, honestly, I have more of a conversation about. And this is not anybody's fault, but the natural progression of new talent coming in and being in favor of that versus hiring, people that have been around for a while. It's what I call the Herb Trimpe effect. There are new ways of doing things now with Photoshop and I'm just talking about like in relationship to doing covers. But now there are a lot more artists that what I call hyper render in Photoshop, and they do these amazing looking paintings. And I'm just like, I don't know how they're doing that on the budget that they're getting paid. And it's moving more towards that kind of Photoshoppy rendering, painterly kind of covers versus the line art that has color on it. And you always worry about becoming obsolete. Like, do people really want to see a Dave Johnson cover versus somebody that can render the hell out of something, if that makes any sense. I don't know. But I'm trying not to be Herb Trimpe, because back in the day, Herb Trimpe was like Marvel's house artist. He always had work. And then Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld came along, and this whole image style happened, and he was a dinosaur at that point, and he couldn't get work. Like, all of a sudden Marvel didn't want to hire him anymore because they had all these new guys that were exciting, and Herb tried to keep up with him, but it was a horrible failure. It looked terrible. And so I've always tried to keep that in mind, like, when is my end date coming? When nobody wants to hire me because there's a million other new, more exciting artists that have come along. So I think hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully there'll always be some place I can do some work, but I think that's just a natural thing. So
sure. Jeff, where you see the company now, I mean, it may jibe completely opposite to how I vibe. Certainly just the stories that are coming forward and the stories that I'm reading. I mean, Nightwing is a huge fan of that book. I'm reading the Supergirl book at the moment as well, which I'm a big fan of. And the Infinite Frontier run, the way that they're looking, evolving their characters. For yourself, how do you see where DC is now and where it can be moving forward in the future?
Well, my personal experience with DC in the last few years has been a Superman issue I did starring the Bizarro, and I think it's a good example of where I think DC is actually at. I was asked to do the book. I read the script. I had some thoughts about the script that would make it better, not only for me to draw, but for someone to enjoy. And everyone agreed that these ideas would make the story more poignant and fit better as a Superman tale and as a Bizarro tale, except that all the other editors had already signed off on the story, as well as the marketing people. And so there were no changes to be made because the group had already decided that that's what the story was going to be before I had ever seen it. And so consequently, the story was just fit into basically a round peg into a square hole. And I think that since the artists and the editors, particularly the editors, no longer have any kind of autonomy, there is no focus on the comic. There's no more like, we're making a good comic and that is our goal. It has to be a part of a larger plan. And I just don't think that's a good way to make comics. Too many cooks in the kitchen, generally speaking, and a watered down product it's not any fun to work on. And I don't think it's any fun to read, really.
Fair enough. We'll try and liven it up with a question in a minute and be a little bit more about it. I am hopefully wanting to get some questions from the audience as well. I know that we've talked a little bit about the business of DC and the relationship with artists in that regard, but you may have a question about DC and DC characters. So have a think about that, because we'll go to a little bit of a Q&A. Are you okay with a couple of Q&A?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Sure.
I will lead into that. We'll give you some time to think about that with this question. Okay, so we've talked about where DC is at the moment. If you had a pitch or a character that you would like to do at DC, a DC character that you would like to do. And like I say, it doesn't have to be one of the Holy Trinity. It could be anyone in the kind of the pantheon. And I've got one in mind. I'm hoping that one of you pick her, and we'll see what happens. Do you have a character that you would love to do a DC book or a short about? I mean, is there someone that you would like to kind of delve in and investigate with DC?
One of their characters or a new character?
Doesn't matter. I think anyone with the DC kind of banner behind them. So
no, I'm just a huge fan of Batman. I really would
love to do a Batman
every
story.
time.
Wow.
It's just one of those things.
Oh wow. Okay. Jeff.
I still have an itch to do Warlord.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And Dave?
Well, unlike Jeff, I like my costumes a little bit more covered up. I know he's got a thing for half naked men.
I like
nothing
skin.
wrong with that. Nothing wrong with
Is this
that.
in comics or just generally?
Just general.
I guess for me, I've been toying with the idea of approaching DC about actually writing a follow-up to Superman Red Son, which it would follow the Batman, Russian Batman. So I guess that would be my choice. Or Big Barda.
That's just got my eyebrows going all the way into the cap. That would be stunning. Okay. No one said Satana. I'm sorry, but I just have a. What can I do? If we can raise the lights a little bit in the audience so we can just see the whites of their eyes a little bit, and hopefully we'll get maybe a question or two.
Hopefully there's an audience out there.
Yeah, there is. I can see them. There we go. We can just see them a bit. Tell you what, I'm hopefully gonna. Yeah, I'll take that off the stand. I'll move a little bit further forward. Obviously, you're gonna may have to shout a little bit, and I'll repeat the question. Does anyone have any questions for these amazing creatives? Go for it, sir. So just to repeat for the Americans, sorry, I'll come down actually. I'll bring the microphone a bit closer. It was more about the question about controversial topics within society in general, and approaching those in comics, and how when creatives do that on the page, that they're often criticized for that, and they're kind of almost challenged for their politics and their views, which they then put onto the page, and perhaps how that everyone seems to be getting offended when it comes to when something gets put out onto the page. I think the question would be, how do these creatives feel about that? And
well, I think one of the biggest problems, I mean, I think the big companies, they sell in mainstream stores, Walgreens and Walmart and so in America. So there's a certain base in America that you cannot offend, and that's always been the case. Unfortunately, it's immediate nowadays, whereas 20, 30 years ago, you had an atrocity of one sort or another, and that would affect editorial decisions. And now you're right. I mean, because of the internet, which is the curse of modern day, any sort of literature, you cannot offend anyone. If you offend one person, things can be banned now. And, we all hear tales of how that can happen. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's the curse of our particular generation, and there's nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. And if we're not careful, then everything will become just pap and blah. So, yeah, we have to fight against it. I don't know how, not with big companies. Anyway, small independents, I think that's the way to go. Then at least they're small enough that you can't sue them.
I know for me as a cover artist, I can't tell you how many times in the past 10 years, like if I've done quite a few covers lately involving, historical narratives like, World War II, and I can't show a Nazi, as a villain. I can't, actually use the symbology because it won't be published in Germany, and it's like, how do I show these are Nazis? I mean, I totally get it. I'm not saying ever to show that in a positive light, but it was part of history. And if you're like, I mean, recently I did covers for a book about Jewish mobsters fighting Nazis in New York, and I can't I can't rely on that imagery, that it's visceral, because it might offend somebody. So I totally get it. It's like a minefield you have to walk sometimes.
I think that was the word I was going to use, Jeff. Minefield is definitely something, the way you can describe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the trick today is that people who don't read comics are looking at comics. And so I think that our audience are not actually the ones who are the minefield. I think that because comics and comic book material has become so popular and so mainstream, that everyone is now looking back at the source and the people of us just doing comics. And we're held to a standard that I think is unfair, since most of the time, anytime we use any kind of offensive imagery, it is in service of the particular story. Like Dave's talking about, if you can't use icons that represent something, it limits your visual lexicon. So I think that most of that critique and most of that minefield is coming from people who don't actually even read comics, which I find incredibly frustrating.
Fair enough. So we have a microphone that is, I believe, wandering around. Here we have a question here at the back of the room. Sir, take it away. Is it sir? I can't quite see. Yes, there we go. Go for it.
Okay, so I like to read stories and watch films and stuff and write my own stuff. So how do I what advice do you have for me when it comes to my stories and stuff?
I think also that you can kind of skew that through the prism of DC as well. I mean, how can you write something that would get their attention?
Well, you can't be commercial. You just sort of like pick on one particular subject that will offend someone, but then it's like flip it on its coin. You can, if you say it's satire, then you can get away with murder. Well, no, you can't. Don't murder anyone. But, if you say it's satire, you can almost get away with murder. But don't.
Yeah. So, writing a story or creating something that would get a mainstream attention, ideally DC. Jeff, ideas?
I think that even for even for the big two companies, right? They are the most commercial. The thing that sells your work is always your personality, your personhood, your personal experience. So no matter who you're working for, even if it's someone that's incredibly commercial and you might feel their constraints there, the best thing you can do as a creator is put as much of yourself into the page as possible. So write what you know, draw what you love. And I think that passion will show through.
Yeah. Also, if you're trying to get work at a big company like Marvel or DC, I mean, it's very hard for a writer just to go, hey, hire me, because editors are busy and they don't have time to read unsolicited material. The best way to go about it, honestly, and I've had a couple of friends that started out this way, they just started with smaller companies. They got their own stories published, and now with the internet, you could do your own webcomic, hire, team up with an artist, get the stuff out there, and if it becomes popular or it starts gaining attention, then eventually you can use that to find a way into one of the bigger companies. But it's very hard just to go, hey, hire me because I've got great ideas. You kind of have to prove it. You kind of have to start small and show that you can get it done and that you can write. And then, that's kind of how you get into the bigger companies. So it's one step at a time.
Yeah, hopefully that helps. I mean, certainly for myself, I've been seeing that those that have been getting a lot of traction with DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, are those that have, the guys say, a little bit of a proven record, but doing stuff on Kickstarter and doing stuff on webcomics. But and they're very personal stories. They're people like Dave was saying. Jeff was saying, very personal voices, and I think that's what they're looking for. They're not just looking for people who are just going to fold into the background now. They are looking for very distinctive voices. We'll have one more question, and I think we'll start wrapping things up. Does anybody have a question? You have a microphone down here. Go for it.
Hi, guys. I've got two linked questions. So firstly, how do you guys feel about working digitally in terms of digital art? Are you like Brian Bolland and Dave Gibbons, who jumped right into digital fully, or have you got this emotional attachment, like older ways of working? And then secondly, do you think that comics have become much more writer-centric recently, right? As a reader, I don't want to sound like a simpleton, but I notice lots of words on the page, and I notice lots of attention to writers over artists. So that's like a craft question and a sort of general comics question.
Yeah, we'll start with that first one with the digital versus old school. Dave, I mean, you were talking about that painterly style that people are creating in Photoshop now and on the Cintrix. So yeah, what's your take on that?
I mean, I love the, using my Cintiq for coloring, but I ultimately would rather draw on paper, and at least having something that you can hold in your hand. Well, you can't really see it, but and it's funny. That's part of my income is reselling the original art to collectors, which you can't really do if you're digital. I know there's a few artists that are trying to do that by only printing one copy of a page. But that to me is like saying, well, here's one Xerox of a page. It's not really, you don't really have the hand to paper visceral reaction that you do, when you're doing stuff with pen and ink. But at the same time, there's so many more tricks and shortcuts that you can do in the computer when you're drawing a page or drawing a cover that I definitely feel like I'm being hamstrung now by not doing it. But, once again, it's a big part of my income now, selling the originals. So but once again, with color, it's so much more easy to do stuff in the computer now than actually painting. So I'm all for it, but at the same time, I'm still holding back. So that's my take on it.
Okay. Jeff?
It really depends on what aspect of the job you're doing. If I'm reading a script and I'm trying to figure out my thumbnails and I'm trying to get an idea for what imagery I'm going to use, that for me is best with sitting outside in a ballpoint pen in the script and doing little side notes, trying to just keep the thinking fluid. If it's something like once you're trying to lay out a page and get everything just right on the page, that's better in Photoshop. And then I like to ink stuff on paper. I'll print that up and then I'll ink it on paper, because otherwise it's too easy to focus in way too close on a page and noodle it to the death, which you won't even see print. It never gets to the actual final product. So I think it's really dependent on where you are in the process, for me anyway.
And yourself, are you still pen and ink?
I think I agree with actually both artists, creators there. But I actually loathe digital. I hate it with a passion. I think it's like anyone who uses digital has signed a pact with the devil. I really think you've sold your soul if you start using digital. Unfortunately, I use digital. So I am actually...
You clapped too soon, you see.
I am empty here. I have no soul. I'm sorry. The great thing about digital, it saves time. If you're a professional artist, you have to save time. So Dave was saying, to do the color, if you come to my table, I'm not socially distanced, you guys. I can actually sell original pages of artwork. And if you come to my table over here, I have some originals. Even if you just want to flick through it and smell them, you can do. Please come over to my table. But the great thing about digital is you see some of the artwork that I did traditionally, that would take me a week to do, and I can't live on a page rate of a week. So I can do now 5 pages a week. So that you had sort of 5 times the income, or once that 150 income. So
I'm just glad no one said the word NTFT at any point throughout that. So I'm very grateful for that. To return to that last question, we'll take it through the prism of DC, and certainly the books that are coming out at the moment, and any books that you have read from DC. Do you feel that they have skewed writer when it comes to the focus of the creative team? Because we have had some incredible writers for DC. I mean, Scott Snyder is continually putting out some great books. I mean, Tom King, across the board. But there does seem to be a focus on the writers. Do you feel that there's that slight skew in the creative teams? Jeff?
You know, I would have said there was a favoritism leaning towards the writers just a few years ago. You know, definitely a decade ago, it was much more of a writer-heavy industry. But now I think that the art is, I don't know if the artists are getting the same sort of credit when it comes to storytelling and designing the world and whatnot, but I do think the quality of art in comics in general has gone up a lot in the last decade. And I think that yes, there's a ton of words on a page, but that page is often beautifully drawn. And so I think that it's a pretty even balance, it seems to me.
Enough. Dave, your thoughts on that? I mean, what books are you reading at the moment? Which writers are catching your attention?
I'll be honest. The past 10 years, I've stopped reading as much as I used to when I was coming up. Especially with the pandemic, I can't remember the last time I actually went to a comic shop. So mainly the comics that I'm reading are comics that I do covers for. And most of those are more, Image and Dark Horse books than anything DC. I used to get all the DC books, but you got to continue to do a certain amount of work for DC to get comps. But back in the old days, I used to get everything. So I can talk about other companies, but as far as DC, the one book that I'm really looking forward to, and I did a variant cover for, and I sent you that cover, was for a new Human Target book done by Tom King and Greg Smallwood. And it's fantastic. I mean, holy moly, it makes me want to stop drawing. It's so good. So I would say definitely check out the new Human Target book. It's a perfect looking book. It's awesome.
It's an amazing creative team that you've mentioned there. I'm also a huge Tom King fan, so yeah, I think that would be worthwhile checking out. Yourself, in terms of the balance between artist and writer, just to wrap things up.
Well, sadly, I tend to get collected editions now, so I'm probably about 2 or 3 years out of date. But I must admit, there's a writer called D. Johnson that I quite like at the moment. So yeah, he's the one I tend to stick to, Dave Johnson.
Excellent stuff. Hopefully you will continue to read
Jeff
DC.
Johnson,
Jeff Johnson, yeah. I'm aware of his work. I'm aware.
I love his covers anyway.
Hopefully you will continue to read DC. I mean, we've kind of talked about how the company is evolving and continually changing, and hopefully we will see more change from the company, hopefully for the better, certainly with the relationship with the artists and with the writers, and hopefully we'll see more great stories on the pages of DC. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please thank our fantastic panel. We've had Dave Johnson on screen joining us a little bit late, but thank you very much indeed, Dave. Jeff Johnson has joined us. Thank you very much indeed. You two can now go back to bed, whatever you're up to. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed to John Higgins as well. Hopefully you'll see John, and like you say, you can go and smell John Higgins artwork on his table if you want to go down to the tent. We've got some more great panels coming up throughout the course of the day. Do check out the rest of the panel stages. I'm going to be on stage with Rachel Smith at 4:30. So if you've been enjoying quarantine comics over the course of pandemic, it's been a little present that showed up in our timelines as we've gone throughout the course of lockdown. Hopefully you can join us for that. Enjoy Meanwhile Comic-Con, ladies and gents, and have yourself a great day. Take care.